Here's a gripping introduction for your YouTube video story. It all started on a quiet evening, just like any other. The city streets were alive with the usual rhythm, cars rushing past, people going about their business, and the occasional wail of sirens piercing the air. But for one man, this night would take an unexpected turn, a moment that would expose everything wrong with the system in just a matter of minutes. He was driving home, minding his own business, like he had done countless times before. His car, sleek but not flashy, moved smoothly along the road, obeying every traffic rule. There was no speeding, no reckless lane switching, nothing that would justify what was about to happen next. But sometimes it's not about what you do. Sometimes it's about who they think you are. Out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. The sharp burst of a siren signaled him to pull over. He sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. This wasn't the first time, and he knew, deep down, it probably wouldn't be the last. Two officers stepped out of their cruiser, their movements tense, aggressive even. Before he could even reach for his license, they were at his window, barking orders. "Step out of the vehicle," one of them shouted. Confused, he hesitated. "Officer, is there a problem?" The second cop wasn't interested in explanations. "I said, get out of the car, now." There was a weight in the air, a familiar tension. He had seen it before, felt it before. A situation like this could go bad fast. So he did what he always did. He stayed calm. He moved carefully, slowly, making sure his hands were always in plain sight. But that didn't matter. The moment he stepped out, one officer grabbed him roughly, pushing him against the car. The other moved toward the driver's seat, peering inside as if searching for something, an excuse, a reason, anything to justify their actions. Then came the sound, a hard crack, metal twisting, a loud bang. The officers had yanked his door too hard, slamming it back with force, damaging the frame. One of them stumbled, knocking his flashlight against the side mirror, sending shards of glass to the pavement. The once pristine car now bore the marks of their recklessness. For a second, there was silence. And then, as if snapping back into reality, one of the cops muttered, "Damn. This was bad." They had messed up, and they knew it. But instead of owning up to it, their aggression only grew. "You're acting suspicious," one of them said, his voice tight with frustration. The man raised an eyebrow. Suspicious, for getting pulled over for no reason, for standing there while they wrecked his car. And then, in the chaos of the moment, as one officer reached for his radio, the man finally spoke with a calmness that cut through the night. "You might want to think carefully about what you do next," he said, "because in about 5 minutes, this situation is going to look very different to you." The officers scoffed. "Yeah, and why's that?" A man who didn't just know the law, he upheld it. And in that moment, the officers' entire demeanor shifted. Their faces drained of color. That arrogance cracked, replaced with something else. Panic. Because now this wasn't just another traffic stop. This wasn't just another man they could intimidate. Now they had a problem. And they knew it. But what happens next? Do they try to cover their tracks? Do they apologize? Or does the situation spiral even further out of control? Keep watching, because this story is far from over. The officers stood frozen, eyes locked on the badge in the man's hand. The golden emblem caught the glare of their patrol car's headlights, reflecting a truth they hadn't been prepared for. A federal judge. Not just another random driver, not someone they could brush off, intimidate, or dismiss. One of them cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly on his feet. "Ah, Judge, we didn't realize." The man didn't say anything. He just held their gaze, waiting. Not angry, not yelling, just watching. And that made it worse. The second officer, the one who had been the most aggressive, took a step back, glancing at the damaged car. The dented door, the shattered side mirror. His face tightened. He knew they had messed up. Badly. For a moment, The only sounds were the distant hum of the city and the crackle of the police radio inside their cruiser. Somewhere down the street, a horn blared, and then everything fell back into a thick, suffocating silence. The judge finally spoke, his voice even. "So, are you going to tell me why I was pulled over?" The officers exchanged a look. There was no good answer to that question. No broken taillight. No speeding violation. Nothing. Just a bad assumption and an even worse reaction. "Well, sir, the first officer struggled for words. "We thought your vehicle matched the description of." The judge let out a slow breath, cutting him off. "Don't do that." The officer blinked. "Do what?" "Lie." It wasn't a request. It was a statement. The weight of the moment settled in. The second officer, the one who had grabbed him, shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Judge, we didn't mean." "You didn't mean to pull me over." The judge's tone was calm but sharp. "You didn't mean to pull me out of my car. You didn't mean to damage my property." Neither officer had an answer. Because they knew the truth. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about something else entirely. About an assumption they had made the moment they saw him behind the wheel. They hadn't seen a judge. They hadn't even seen a man. They had seen a problem. And now, standing in front of him, they were realizing just how big of a mistake they had made. The first officer tried to recover, his voice tight. "Sir, we can take care of the damage. We can file a report, get it fixed." The judge let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You think this is about a broken mirror?" The officer swallowed. "We just want to make this right." "Make it right." The judge finally put his badge away, taking a step closer. "Let me ask you something. If I wasn't who I am, what would have happened here tonight?" Neither officer answered. The judge nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." A car passed by on the street, the driver slowing down just enough to glance at the scene. The flashing lights, the tense figures standing in the glow of the headlights. The judge could imagine what it must look like from the outside. Another routine stop. Except it wasn't routine at all. Because this time, they had pulled over the wrong man. The second officer, the one who had been gripping his arm just moments ago, finally found his voice. "Look, Judge, we..." Before he could finish, the judge reached into his pocket again. Both officers tensed, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters, as if their bodies had been trained to expect the worst. "I haven't decided," he admitted. The man nodded, understanding. "You know this isn't going away." "I know." The two men stood there for a moment, watching the officers by their car. "This isn't just about them," the judge said quietly. "It's about all of it. The system. The way this keeps happening." The man's expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "Then let's do something about it." The judge looked at him, considering. The officers remained frozen by their car, their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes darting back and forth. They had started the night with control, with power. But now, they weren't sure how this was going to end. Neither was the judge. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The night felt colder now, heavier. The officers stood by their cruiser, hands stiff at their sides, eyes darting between each other and the judge. The weight of their mistake had settled fully now, pressing down on them with a force neither had expected. They weren't in control anymore. The situation had slipped through their fingers the moment that badge came out, and now they were waiting for something they couldn't predict, something they couldn't talk their way out of. The judge could feel it too, the shift, the unspoken understanding that no matter how this night ended, it had already exposed something raw. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the system, believing that accountability meant something. But right now, standing here, looking at these officers, feeling the sting of what had just happened, he wasn't sure anymore. The man who had arrived, the one the judge had called, took a slow step forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "You two have a decision to make." The officers tensed, but they didn't speak. The man continued, his tone measured but firm. "We can handle this officially. Reports, investigations, You know what that means. He let the words hang there, giving them just enough time to think about how much worse this could get. Or he let the sentence trail off, the unspoken alternative lingering between them. The second officer, the one who had been most aggressive, finally spoke, his voice uneven. We didn't know. His throat bulged as he swallowed. We didn't know who he was. The judge studied him. Would have mattered. The officer hesitated, just for a second, but the silence that followed was answer enough. The first officer, the one who had tried to smooth things over, stepped in. We. He took a breath, then shook his head. What do you want us to do? The man beside the judge didn't answer right away. He turned to the judge instead, waiting, because this wasn't just about policy or procedure. This was personal now. The judge didn't respond immediately either. He looked at the officers, at their cruiser, at his car, the broken mirror, the dented door, the reminder of what had happened here tonight. He thought about all the times this had happened to others who didn't have a badge to pull out, who didn't have the power to make these men nervous, who didn't have someone to call. Finally, he exhaled. You want to know what I want? His voice was low, steady. I want to know what you would have done if I was just some man driving home. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. Look, the man who had arrived, the one the judge had called, took a slow step forward, his voice cutting through the silence. You two have a decision to make. The officers tensed, but they didn't speak. The man continued, his tone measured but firm. We can handle this officially. Reports, investigations, you know what that means. He let the words hang there, giving them just enough time to think about how much worse this could get. Or he let the sentence trail off, the unspoken alternative lingering between them. The second officer, the one who had been most aggressive, finally spoke, his voice uneven. We didn't know. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. We didn't know who he was. The judge studied him. Would have mattered. The officer hesitated, just for a second, but the silence that followed was answer enough. The first officer, the one who had tried to smooth things over, stepped in. We. He took a breath, then shook his head. What do you want us to do? The man beside the judge didn't answer right away. He turned to the judge instead, waiting, because this wasn't just about policy or procedure. This was personal now. The judge didn't respond immediately either. He looked at the officers, at their cruiser, at his car, the broken mirror, the dented door, the reminder of what had happened here tonight. He thought about all the times this had happened to others who didn't have a badge to pull out, who didn't have the power to make these men nervous, who didn't have someone to call. Finally, he exhaled. You want to know what I want? His voice was low, steady. I want to know what you would have done if I was just some man driving home. The second officer shifted uncomfortably. Look, The judge turned at the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he didn't speak yet. The woman's gaze swept over the scene, taking in the crushed side mirror, the dented door, the tension in the air. Then she settled her eyes on the officers. Interesting, she said finally, her tone unreadable. The first officer swallowed hard. Who are you? The woman didn't answer right away. She just let the question sit there, stretching out the silence. Then she slowly reached into her blazer, pulling out an ID. Department of Justice, she said simply. The second officer stiffened. The first officer went pale. The judge's expression didn't change. He had called for backup, but not the kind these officers had expected. The woman looked at the judge now. You said it happened again. The judge gave a small nod. It did. Her gaze sharpened, and she turned back to the officers. I assume you've already given a full statement. Neither of them spoke. She tilted her head slightly, waiting. No. A small, knowing smirk touched her lips. Then let's start now. The second officer shifted, trying to regain some control. Look, Don't, she cut in smoothly. Just stop. She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. We both know where this is going. We both know what happened here. The first officer took a step forward, his voice unsteady. We didn't know who he was. The woman raised an eyebrow. Oh, and if you had. The officer hesitated, realizing the trap in her words. She nodded as if that answered everything. That's what I thought. The second officer took a breath, forcing his voice to stay level. Are we being investigated? The woman didn't blink. You are now. The tension cracked open into something heavier. The weight of those words hit the officers hard. They had expected a warning. A lecture maybe, not this. The first officer clenched his jaw. This is all a misunderstanding. The woman's lips curved slightly. Misunderstandings don't require internal affairs or federal oversight. She glanced at the judge, then back at them. But this does. The second officer's hands curled into fists at his sides. We didn't do anything wrong. The judge finally spoke, his voice steady. Then why are you afraid? That landed harder than anything else. The second officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because there was no good answer. The woman turned slightly, speaking to the judge now. Do you want to move forward with this? The judge didn't answer right away. He let the question sit. Because this wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't just about him. It was about what happened next. And no matter what he chose, nothing would ever be the same. The air was thick with tension as the judge held the weight of the question in his mind. Everything had led to this moment. The officers stood frozen, their world tilting under them. The DOJ official watched him closely, waiting for his decision. The man he had called earlier remained silent, his presence steady but unreadable. The second officer, the more aggressive one, finally snapped. This is ridiculous. His voice was tight, strained. We didn't hurt anyone. We made a mistake. That's it. His partner shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing too late that there was no talking their way out of this. The judge studied them. Their faces, their body language, the way their fear had shifted from power slipping away to the consequences catching up to them. He had spent his career upholding justice, making sure the law was applied fairly. But tonight, standing on the side of the road, he realized how easily fairness could be decided by the people who had the power in the moment. I could press charges, he said, his voice calm but firm. You'd be investigated, your records reviewed, every stop, every complaint, every moment where your judgment has been questioned. The first officer's throat bulged as he swallowed hard. The judge took a step closer, his eyes steady. Tell me, when's the last time you pulled over someone who looked like you and treated them the way you treated me? The second officer flinched, but the first one had no answer. The silence was louder than any excuse they could have given. The DOJ official cleared her throat. Judge, we can take this all the way. She wasn't pressuring him, just stating a fact. But once we do, it won't just be about them. This will open a door that people won't be able to close again. The judge already knew that. If he went forward, it wouldn't just be about two officers making a bad call. It would be about every bad call before this. Every person who didn't have a badge to protect them. Every moment like this one that had gone unchecked. He turned back to the officers. You've been given the benefit of the doubt your whole careers, but that ends tonight. The second officer's jaw tightened, his breathing shallow. The first officer just stood there, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. The judge finally exhaled. You'll resign, he said, his voice steady. Both of you. The second officer's head snapped up. You can't. I can. The judge's tone didn't change. Or we can let this go public. Let people see exactly what you've done. Let them decide what happens to you. The second officer's face twisted in anger, but the first officer, he understood. His eyes flicked to the woman from the DOJ, to the silent man standing nearby, to the judge. He knew there was no way out of this, not without losing more than just their badges. The first officer gave a slow nod. We'll resign. The second officer spun toward him. What? No, we'll resign, the first officer repeated, quieter this time. His voice was hollow, but he knew it was over. The judge held his gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. He looked at the woman from the DOJ. "Make sure they do." She smiled slightly satisfied. "Consider it done." The officers stood there, stunned, as the reality set in. The cruiser, the authority, the power they once held, it was all slipping away. The judge turned back to his car. The damage was still there. The reminder of everything that had happened tonight. But it no longer felt like just another incident. It felt like a shift. Like something had cracked open that couldn't be closed again. Just as he was about to get inside, the first officer called out, "Judge." The judge paused, glancing back. The officer's face was tired, his shoulders heavy. "Would it really have been different if we had known who you were?" The judge held his gaze for a moment, then shook his head. "That's the problem." He got into his car, started the engine, and pulled away. The night was still dark. The road stretched ahead. But this time, something felt different. Something had changed. And this wasn't the end, this was just the beginning. As the judge drove away, the events of the night replayed in his mind like an old film reel. The flashing lights, the raised voices, the way the officers had looked at him before and after they knew who he was, it all stayed with him. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, staring at the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent years believing that progress had been made, that the law could protect people the way it was meant to. But tonight had proven something he had always known deep down. The law only worked when the people enforcing it believed in fairness. And too often, fairness was decided by power, not by justice. He sighed, loosening his grip on the wheel. The road was mostly empty now, quiet except for the hum of the engine. He wasn't going straight home, not yet. Instead, he turned onto a familiar street, one lined with houses he had known since childhood. It didn't take long before he reached a small, well-kept house with a porch light glowing in the darkness. He parked and stepped out, taking a slow breath before walking up the front steps. He knocked twice, then waited. After a few moments, the door opened, and an older man stood there, his face lined with wisdom and years of hard-earned experience. "Wasn't expecting you tonight," the man said, stepping aside to let him in. The judge walked inside, the warmth of the home instantly settling into his bones. He had spent so many nights here as a boy, listening to the man's stories, learning lessons that would shape him into who he was. "I needed to talk," the judge admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. The older man, his former mentor, and the reason he had pursued law in the first place, nodded knowingly. "Sit down," he said. They settled into the living room, the soft hum of an old clock filling the silence. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It happened again," he said finally. The older man didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. The judge exhaled, staring at the floor. "I thought I was past feeling this way. I thought that if I worked hard enough, earned my place, did everything right, I wouldn't have to deal with this anymore." He shook his head. "But it doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter what I've accomplished. To some people, I'll always just be a man they think they can treat however they want." His mentor studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Did you make them pay for it?" The judge looked up, meeting his eyes. "I made them resign." The older man nodded, considering that. "Good." The judge frowned. "But is it enough?" His mentor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Enough for what?" The judge let out a slow breath. "To change things." The older man was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "You've been trying to change things from the inside for a long time, and that's important. But change doesn't come from just one person, no matter how powerful they are. It comes from people refusing to accept things the way they are." The judge ran a hand over his face. "It just feels like a cycle. Every time we take a step forward, something like this happens and reminds me how far we still have to go." His mentor gave a small smile. "That's because the work is never done." The judge let those words settle. He knew they were true, but that didn't make them easier to accept. He had spent his whole career believing in the system, believing that justice was possible. But justice wasn't automatic. It wasn't something that simply happened. It had to be fought for, over and over again. After a long moment, he nodded. I know. His mentor patted his knee before standing up. Then keep going. The judge stood as well, feeling just a little lighter than before. Thank you. The older man gave him a knowing look. You don't have to thank me. Just make sure the next time something like this happens, you don't hesitate to do what's right. The judge nodded he would. As he left the house and got back into his car, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. He knew this wasn't the last time he would face something like tonight. He knew there would always be people who abused their power, who thought they could get away with treating others unfairly. But he also knew this. He wasn't powerless, and neither was anyone else who refused to accept it. As he drove home, the city lights flickering in the distance, he made a silent promise to himself. He would keep fighting. He would keep pushing for justice, because no matter how slow change felt, no matter how exhausting the fight became, it was a fight worth having. And tonight was proof that even the smallest shift could make a difference.